If you've ever cleaned out an attic, you know that sometimes there are priceless treasures that we used to call junk, which are no longer junk. That's the case of some pictures we're going to show you this evening of past of Miami, which, except for these pictures, would have been lost for all of us. It's this book that has the collection of pictures called The Forgotten Frontier, and it's by Arva Moore Parks, who was born and raised in Miami, right?
Right.
And as you said, the great way to become a historian is to just grow older. So yeah, I guess we're all going to be historians. Tell us how you ran across these pictures and who took them.
Well, I was involved with the purchase of the barnacle by the state of Florida and doing some of the research, and the Munro family had lived in this same house since 1891.
Now, the barnacle is, a lot of people don't know who.
The barnacle is a state historic site now. It's down on Main Highway in Coconut Grove, and it's the home of Ralph M. Munro, who was a Coconut Grove pioneer. And the family had lived there since 1891, and in the process of cleaning out to move in 1973 when the state bought the house, up in the attic were boxes and boxes of Munro's glass plate negatives from pictures he had taken starting as early as 1883 when he was down here.
When did the first people come down here, white people, to settle?
Well, we had a Spanish mission on the north bank of the Miami River in 1567, but then there was quite sporadic through the next years. The real beginning pioneer settlement type thing would be in the 1850s and 60s.
So these pictures start shortly after that?
Well, as soon as cameras were really available, there's some really very early, even as far as photography is concerned.
Okay, we're going to show you some. Now, just kind of give us a running description of what we're seeing.
This is a wreck on the reef right off of our area. The reef starts there at Valley Rock, and the wrecks just occurred very, very frequently, especially after we became a state of the United States and the shipping increased. And this brought our first kind of permanent settlers here, which were basically Bahamians who came from the Bahamas to salvage these. This would be all of these are really in the 1880s, 1890s.
Very good.
This is the Cape Florida Lighthouse, which has been restored. The keeper's house has been rebuilt. This was taken in the 1880s, and it's the only known photograph with the roof still on the original keeper's house. This is our oldest historic landmark. It was built in 1825, soon after the purchase of Florida, in order to try to stop the wrecks, but it didn't stop them very much.
The United States government built it, right?
Right, United States government built it.
And it's still there on Key Biscayne.
And it's open to the public. State of Florida owns this too. This is a typical house of these very first pioneers, especially those of Bahamian ancestry. This house was in the Keys, and if you'll notice the rain barrel, that was the only way they had water. And they don't have any screens. They would close the shutters of these houses and put kind of smoke bombs inside to fight off the mosquitoes, which were the worst problem in South Florida in the early days.
They still are.
They still are, but not this time of year. They were around all year long, apparently, then. This is one of my favorite pictures in the whole collection. In the early 1880s, Charles and Isabella Peacock built the first hotel on the South Florida mainland called the Bayview House, later the Peacock Inn, and it was right down in the park in Coconut Grove. There's a historic marker there now. And this was really the front door of the first civilization in South Florida, the first real community. And those are Seminole Indians in the dugouts. They're going to the inn, and that was the dock. And that would be right at the foot of McFarland Road there.
Now what's there now?
The park is there. Peacock Park it's called in honor of this family.
Very good.
This is the famous picture, the first tourist season in Miami, which is 1887. These people came down to stay at the Peacock Inn. Ralph Munro, who was also living down there, was from Staten Island, and he brought these people from the north down to see this great tropical place that he had discovered. And that's really the beginning of our idea of tourism.
Did they have rain all the time they were here?
No, they came in December and January. It was very nice.
The classic tourist complaint is like, went to Florida and it rained all the time.
That's right.
Doesn't happen very often.
This picture is the Christmas of 1887. And what's so interesting about it, the Peacocks had a Christmas party at the Bayview House, which was the hotel, and they invited everyone that lived in what is now Greater Miami, and that is everyone that lived in what is now Greater Miami.
Good heavens.
It's about 70 people, and they came all the way from Lemon City, which is up Biscayne Boulevard in 60s northeast, down to what they call the hunting grounds, which we would call the Cutler Ridge area, and they're all there.
And that's Christmas of what year?
1887.
1887.
The pioneer types, mostly of a Bahamian background, who had been here from the 1850s and on, looked at them on these tourists, many of which who ended up settling here, and called them the swells. And I think this picture kind of shows how they got that name. The thing that was amazing about that first tour season picture, that most of those people ended up moving to Coconut Grove and making it their permanent home, and kind of put a stamp on the Grove, I think, that's still there.
All of Miami started at where we now have Coconut Grove, right?
Right, that's really our oldest
Yeah.
community. It's
Okay.
kind of compares to Miami as Georgetown would to Washington, D.C. It was there first,
Right.
and later kind of absorbed by it.
Well, that's just a small, that's, how many pictures in the book?
Oh, about 280, I
So
think.
you can see that's just a very small piece of the pictorial history of the early days. What brought the first person down here? Were they hearing tales up north that there's a great climate way down there?
It's hard to say. I think they were more like adventurers. That you would go somewhere today as an adventurer unless you came over from the Bahamas or something. Ralph Munro heard about the wrecking from a wrecker who was up in New York, and that's what brought him down.
Really? Now, what I think we tend to forget is 1896 or 1887, the United States was a very flourishing place then. New York City was in its boom times around the turn of the century. It wasn't that we were a primitive society generally, but we still were unknown at that point, which always amazes people.
We were so isolated.
Yeah.
You know, think of the geography down here at the end, and there was no way to get here except by water. There was no overland way until the 1890s, because you get down here except by boat.
You had been a student of the history of South Florida, and then you came across these pictures. Did they tell you anything you hadn't known, or were they surprising to you in any way?
Oh yes, there's nothing like a picture's worth 1,000 words. It's so true. Things you would research, and you would have one picture in your mind from reading about it, and then you'd see it, and it might completely change your perception. There's one house in there where I had read it was the most improved house on the bay, and I had this mansion-y looking thing in my mind, and it was just another pioneer house.
Yeah.
It just apparently must have had curtains in the window or something a little finer, and it just really changed your perception once you saw the pictures.
Do you get a feeling that people are more interested in the past than they used to be, or are we becoming more historically oriented?
The last 2 years, there's been a real change, especially here in Miami. Yes, I'm kind of a missionary on our history in Miami, that we have it and should appreciate it, and I see a real change. It's very exciting.
Well,
to
maybe
see
it's because of books like yours. Let's show them the cover again, so if anybody wants, it's called The Forgotten Frontier, and we're happy to observe that it's no longer forgotten because it's all in this book by Arva Moore Parks. And Arva, we thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, John.
All right. We'll be right back.